On the occasion of the publication of the book, The Assassination of Neville Wran, it's published by Connor Court, and a lot of us authors are very grateful that Connor Court publishes books, and this is an important book that's just been published. So Milton Cockburn's well known to you. I will introduce him briefly. And a former advisor to Neville Wran for 4 years. He's, of course, is the former editor of the Sydney Morning Herald and co-author of Wran, an unauthorised biography, and of this book, The Assassination of Neville Wran. The topic for tonight's discussion is the ABC and others versus Neville Wran, and the occasion is a launch of the book, so I declare the book well and truly launched.
It is rather intimidating. In the front row I've got a former High Court judge and a former Chief Prosecutor, so question time could be interesting. But firstly, thank you very much to Gerard and Anne for the opportunity to speak tonight and to speak about the book. And thank you to the Sydney Institute staff for the organisation. I also want to acknowledge, as Gerard did, Connor Court, the publishers of the book. This book would not have been published without Connor Court. I got knocked back, not as much as Jane Austen got over Pride and Prejudice, but quite a few of the publishers came back and said they thought the story was too New South Wales centric for them. So it's rather ironic that it's a Queensland-based publisher that came to the party, and also amusing that the two extracts of the book that have appeared so far have appeared in national newspapers. Joking with Anne, Anne had stressed, or Gerard had stressed, this wasn't actually a launch of the book, it was an event about the book. But we all went to a launch yesterday of Michael Eason's biography of John Christian Watson, and I'm afraid he set quite a standard for launches. He generously put on quite a spread, paid for by himself. He managed to get the Prime Minister to come and launch the book. And then copies of the book were available free to everyone who turned up. So I assure you tonight, Connor Court are not quite so generous, and you'll have to pay full price for the book tonight. The final thank you I've got, because Brian Dale got very upset with me about the fact that in the preface to the book I thank all my mates, particularly my luncheon mates, and make no reference of my wife, Rosemary Crowe. Those who know Rosemary will know that she would refuse to have any such acknowledgement, but certainly I want to acknowledge Rosemary tonight. I don't think she envisaged the first few years of retirement were going to be spent with me locked in a study and spending days in the State Library. So thank you, Rosemary. Now on the book. Last year, while I was still working on the book, obviously, I unfortunately had to attend a marvellous wake for one of my old friends, Robert Millikan. Rob and I met in the early 1980s at the old Fairfax newspaper company, and the wake therefore was something of a reunion of Fairfax old-timers. During the afternoon, I spoke to a woman who, when I was just a novice journalist, was regarded as a journalistic goddess, not just at Fairfax, but in Sydney generally. When I told her what I was working on in response to her question, she told me, "I've got a Neville Wran story." She then proceeded to tell me what I'd regard as a mildly scandalous story about Wran, and her source, it turned out, her sole source, was the granddaughter of one of her neighbours, who happened to be a waitress at a restaurant. I was taken back, not by the story, because as I said, on my scale of scandals, it was pretty mild, but by the fact that this venerable journalist, who was trained in the days when multiple sources were mandatory on the Sydney Morning Herald, now regarded a young waitress as a reliable, uncorroborated source. On another occasion, when a non-journalist friend asked me the same question and I told him, he replied, "Are you going to cover his bisexuality?" I can assure you that certainly caused belly laughs among former Wran staffers and his friends when I relayed the conversation to them. Both incidents illustrate a difficulty which confronts anyone who is writing about a public figure in Sydney. As I write in the book, Sydney, more than any other Australian city, floats on malicious rumours and unsubstantiated gossip. Scandal-mongering is a currency for many. Too often, gossip passes for fact in this city. And this is something that all journalists should have drummed into them very early in their careers. Very few public works projects begin or are completed without an allegation of someone copping a quid, usually emanating from unsuccessful bidders or project opponents. Family members, unhappy with their financial lot, hurl accusations against other family members and their associates. Neville Wran is not the only public figure to fall victim to this Sydney disease, but he is certainly one of the most prominent. And in the first chapter of the book, I list several unsubstantiated pieces of gossip about Wran. All of them I've easily disproved, even though these are not the substantive content of the book. All have been published without corroboration after Wran's death. Wran spoke of this phenomenon after his complete exoneration by a royal commission of an allegation that he had perverted the course of justice. He said, and I quote, "After the findings of the Street Royal Commission, we are all entitled to believe that the tactic of smear and innuendo, of guilt by association, of rumours without substance would stop. But every time some fabrication is completely disposed of, another allegation is fabricated. The very frequency of allegations, their repetition and regurgitation, no matter how many times they are proved to be false, becomes proof that something is wrong." Of all those fabrications that I referred to in the first chapter, my favourite is a supposed lunchtime meeting between Wran, shortly after he became Premier, and crime boss Abe Saffron at a popular restaurant. Now, it just so happens that that restaurant didn't come into existence until 5 years after the meeting allegedly took place. Of course, such gossip can only be published because of the law that the dead can be defamed, but the relatives of the dead have no legal recourse against such defamation. In this book, I also address the various events which are cited as evidence that Wran was personally corrupt and that he had run a corrupt administration. These are not just the most recent ones, such as the now thoroughly discredited Luna Park fire documentary in March 2021, and the laughable claims by former Chief Magistrate Clary Breeze in his book published also in 2021. I've gone back to Wran's time in government and objectively, and I believe forensically, examined in separate chapters various incidents and events of that time which are claimed to cast a shadow over his reputation. These include Wran's reluctance to tackle corruption in the New South Wales Police Force and his promotion of a senior policeman, Bill Allen, later found to be corrupt. Wran's long friendship, beginning in the 1940s at Sydney University Law School, with controversial bookmaker Bill Waterhouse. The extension of the term of Chief Magistrate Murray Farquhar, later found to have been corrupt, which led, of course, to the Street Royal Commission. An allegation of political patronage arising out of the so-called age tapes. Wran's dealings with media moguls Kerry Packer and Rupert Murdoch, and claims that Wran sought to protect his Corrective Services Minister Rex Jackson after revelations of the corruption of the prisoner early release scheme. I've also got a chapter on corruption allegations made after their deaths, of course, against two Wran ministers, both known to be close to Wran. A separate chapter details how Wran accumulated his wealth, since the size of his estate has also fed rumours of corruption. I have conclusively demonstrated that it is Malcolm Turnbull, with early help from Nick Whitlam, who made Wran a wealthy man, although not as wealthy as the media reported on his death. Some of you will have read the extract of that chapter in the Financial Review. I urge you to read the full chapter, which is obviously about twice as long as the extract. My conclusion following this detailed examination is the reason for the title of the book, The Assassination of Neville Wran. Objective readers of the book, I believe, will agree that I have disproved the corruption narrative about Wran. I've been critical of much of the reporting of these incidents and events, including from some very distinguished journalists. Some of it is just the result of journalistic laziness, including a failure to carry out basic checking. Much of it, I'm afraid to say, is journalistic malpractice, including a failure to corroborate allegations and simply reporting allegations and gossip as fact. Now, given the Institute tonight has highlighted the ABC in the title of the address, I should mention that as well as exposing the shocking journalism of the Ghost Train Fire documentary, I've also exposed the poor journalism involved in an earlier Four Corners program which made allegations about Wran. I'm not referring to the controversial Four Corners The Big League program in 1983, which led directly to the Street Royal Commission. I concede that this program had reliable and multiple corroboration for its central allegation, and the allegation was that Murray Farquhar had used Neville Wran's name in trying to fix a committal hearing. It also had the guts to name Wran, which the later Four Corners program that I referred to did not. It used the phrase, I think, a senior New South Wales politician, knowing full well that everyone would fill in the blanks. My criticism of the Big League program is that it didn't concede in the program that Farquhar may have been using Wran's name for his own nefarious purposes, as the Royal Commission subsequently found to be the case. Both the journalist Chris Masters and the executive producer Jonathan Holmes have subsequently conceded that the program should have done so. Chris Masters has said that publicly, and Jonathan Holmes conceded that in an email to me, which I quote. In the final chapter, I explore the issue of why Wran has attracted so many claims of corruption. I was struck by the contrast with the former Labor Prime Minister Bob Hawke, following the publication of Troy Bramston's very substantial biography of Hawke. Bramston, who had the full cooperation of Hawke, reveals the financial support given to him before entering Parliament by business friends, particularly transport magnate Sir Peter Abels. He reports that they paid his hotel bills, picked up the tab at the Boulevard Hotel, provided him with drinks, cigars and women. Abels, according to Bramston, also paid Hawke's mortgage and his children's private school fees, as well as bailing him out of gambling debts. Now, these revelations received very little publicity when the biography was released and since. Sex trumps money in public appeal. Commentary on the book centred on Hawke's frenetic sexual exploits, even though these did not come under the heading of breaking news. There is no evidence that the financial revelations have impacted or will impact on Hawke's considerable reputation and popularity, nor, and I really want to stress this point, nor do I regard this as evidence of Hawke behaving corruptly while in office. Such a revelation about Wran, however, would be regarded as game, set and match by those who accuse him of being corrupt. I spend several pages in this book addressing an uncorroborated allegation that Wran accepted $5,000 from his bookmaking friend Bill Waterhouse just before the 1976 election. This has been put forward by one journalist as evidence that Wran was, and I quote, as bent as a $3 note, end quote. I've shown that this transaction, if indeed it occurred, and it's uncorroborated, is most likely to have been an election donation, not a payment to Wran personally. Those here tonight of my age will recall that the bookmakers' turnover tax was a very big issue in that 1976 election campaign. I might add that it was the Wran government which pioneered the disclosure of the reporting of election donations, the transparency of election donations. In this final chapter, I examine various theories which have been put forward about why Wran attracted corruption rumours during his time in office. Some of these I find persuasive, others I find less convincing. One theory which I do find persuasive is that Wran's initial reluctance to clean up the cops, to use Frank Walker's phrase, fed suspicions among some. Max Walsh wrote in the Sydney Morning Herald on the day after Wran announced his resignation as Premier, and I quote, "It was his failure to move to reform the police at the outset of his administration which fueled speculation of underlying corruption within the ranks of the Wran government." Max Walsh was a respected former editor and commentator, and this undoubtedly was groupthink in certain journalistic quarters and among some political activists. In the book I outline why I believe it was naive to expect Wran early in his premiership and with a one-seat majority to begin a clean-out of the Augean stables. I cite opinion polls showing just how favourably the New South Wales public viewed the New South Wales police force in those days. A more reasonable criticism, in my view, is that the Wran government was slow to take this on when the political environment became more amenable to reform. When Wran did move, it was with characteristic decisiveness, assisted by a reforming police minister in Peter Anderson. I think Peter might be here tonight. He is. By then, however, it was seen as something that Wran was forced to do and something for which his government has received little credit. Of course, this theory and others that I discuss in the final chapter do not explain why Wran has attracted so many allegations of corruption after his death. The explanation for this rests squarely with parts of the media and goes to the journalistic laziness and malpractice that I referred to earlier. And of course, our defamation laws, which encourage journalists to bring out your dead, have enabled such malpractice. Too often today, hearsay is considered acceptable evidence of guilt. Inconvenient evidence to the contrary is now blithely ignored. Gossip is now regarded as truth. Conviction of corruption has now replaced suspicion. Journalists no longer explore the background and motives of those making allegations. The requirement for allegations to be corroborated by an independent source, let alone multiple sources, is now considered old-fashioned. The defamation laws have become a convenient excuse for journalists for not having sought to establish the truth or otherwise of allegations while Wran was alive. Those same journalists have taken advantage of the defamation laws to declare open season on Wran's reputation after his death. The freedom from legal consequences of defaming the dead is a legal privilege for journalists. Many journalists no longer accept that with legal privilege comes moral responsibility. And still the media wonders why parliaments are so reluctant to liberalise the defamation laws. One journalist who's published several allegations after Wran's death, all of them uncorroborated, has claimed all we owe to the dead is the truth. This is a noble sentiment, but allegations without evidence or independent corroboration do not establish guilt. Gossip and hearsay are not truth. Journalists should be healthily sceptical of those who hurl allegations and should not automatically accept such people as virtuous and pure of heart. Allegations about the dead should receive the same care, corroboration and scrutiny as allegations about the living. The character assassination of Neville Wran is mainly attributable to the media abandoning the moral responsibility that once went hand in hand with legal privilege. Thanks, Gerard.
Thanks, Milton. As I said, there are copies of The Assassination of Neville Wran here tonight, and I'm sure the author will be happy to sign after the event. We'll also advertise them online for our people on Zoom or those who are watching this later on YouTube or on our website or wherever. So if you just come back, Milton, I'll just start off. Just give us a bit of, come up here. Just give us a bit of background. I arrived in Sydney in 1984. I could never quite understand the opposition to Wran from the media because he seemed to me to be, he'd come out of the Labor left, I think. He'd become Premier. He was running, that might be wrong, he was running a pretty responsible government, seemed to be working well. I could never understand the hostility. But before you get into that, just tell us a bit about Neville Wran, the person. What's his background? How does he get where he gets until he steps down as Premier?
Well, taking the second bit first, Wran didn't enter Parliament until he was 43, and it took him, from memory, Brian, I think about 4 goes, didn't it, to get elected first of all to the Legislative Council. He was a barrister. It was started off as a solicitor, of course, then a barrister, then a QC. Michael Kirby appeared often as Neville's junior, commencing a long friendship between Michael and Neville. When he finally got into the Legislative Council, his talents were very quickly recognised, and within a space of about 18 months, he'd become leader of Labor, leader of the opposition in the Legislative Council. And by then, of course, his talents were well recognised, so that at the 1973 election, which saw Terry Sheehan elected to Parliament, a safe seat was arranged for him in Bass Hill, which is in Western Sydney. It was well known, or well speculated before that election, which was Pat Hills's, I think, third election. It was well speculated that if Pat lost that election, then Wran would challenge for the leadership, which is precisely what happened. It was a very close-run thing. 3 candidates, Pat, Kevin Stewart and Wran. And Wran really only won that because Michael Cleary, who'd won the then marginal seat, or the very marginal seat of Coogee, was facing a challenge in the Court of Disputed Returns. In fact, I think they ordered the new by-election. So Michael was unable to vote in the ballot. If he had voted, it's almost certain that he would have voted for Pat, which meant that Wran would not have become leader of the opposition in 1973. He then won again, luckily won the 76 election, I think with 1 seat majority. And if you add up the votes, I think of the 3 most marginal seats, I think if about 120 people had voted in a different way, Wran would have been heading back to the bar, because, as Brian wrote in his book, Wran only ever intended 1 shot at the premiership, and if he'd missed out, he was certainly heading back to the bar. There was a lot of criticism of Wran in the first term of office. It was sort of seen as a bit of a do-nothing government. People didn't really make allowance for the fact that it was a government with a 1-seat majority and didn't have a majority in the upper house. But after the so-called Wran slide in '78, which led to the reform of the upper house, led to a majority in the upper house, I outline in the very first chapter of the book some of the reforms, and it's very easy to forget what a reformist government the Wran government was. He didn't really come out of the left. He was, I suppose, factional, but his talents were recognised by both the left and the right. Although I think it's fair to say that it was the fact that they lost 3 elections in a row was the driving force. No doubt he was a civil libertarian, and a lot of the problems I outline in the book, a lot of the issues that he's criticised for, stem from Wran's very devout adherence to the principle of the rule of law, and he wouldn't regard people as being corrupt or wouldn't accept allegations without proper evidence. And in the chapter on Rex Jackson, I go into that in some considerable detail. The reason, Gerard, for the fact that he wasn't, by '84, it's fair to say that there was a fair bit of media criticism. I think the Bill Allen affair in particular, I think, was one that turned media attitudes towards Wran hostile. But I think it's a distinction between the political journalists and journalists outside of Macquarie Street. I think Wran was everything that political journalists find attractive: intelligent, articulate, victorious, adroit. Outside of Macquarie Street, there was a lot of cynicism about Wran. Part of it was the fact that they felt that he was getting an easy run from their Macquarie Street colleagues. Part of it, as I said, was this underlying suspicion, mainly as a result of the failure to clean up the cops. There was a lot of this suspicion about Wran, and that's probably what you detected when you arrived here in '84.
Just tell us the year he stepped down. I remember Neville Wran, he came to our first annual dinner. I remember him telling me that he thought he'd stayed on a couple of years too long, and if he'd had a chance, he wouldn't. If he'd been able to get out earlier, he would have got out a bit earlier. So what dates are we talking about?
Well, he won very convincingly in 1981. That was the second landslide election, and then the 1984 election was held, I think, in the wake of the Rex Jackson affair, but I think before the Four Corners program, wasn't it, Terry? No. After, right. But even so, they still in 1984 still had a very comfortable majority. I think the majority was about 17 seats when Wran retired. Brian and David Hurley would be better placed to answer this question. But I suspect that after '84, and you might remember after that period, there was a long period, about 12, 18 months, where Wran's popularity dropped substantially. But he then clawed his way back in both the public opinion polls and also with a couple of by-election wins. So by the time he did announce his retirement in '86, while I think it was probably an appropriate time for him to go, I mean, he at that stage, of course, had served for 10 years, and it was a record at that stage, 10 years of continuous service. I think that if things had been different, if things had been different, he probably would have got out earlier. But I don't think after the '84 election I think he would have been determined not to get out until actually he'd restored the standing.
Milton, as a fresh-faced Victorian, there are none left. In 1984, we came up to Sydney. I was teaching on the Lower North Shore. We had Maud Ryan's daughter in the school, but it was just awash with stories of New South Wales corruption. You know, this was the big corrupt state. But the longer I've lived here, it was the same with Asquith. And what is it? What's the connection? Were there too many figures that knew each other from legal, political, business and nefarious activities at the cross, wherever? I mean, what is it about the New South Wales connection group, whatever, that this stuff bubbles up?
Well, many... Yeah, well, I was going to say, many people do trace it back to the Rum Corps, of course, Anne. I'm not sure that... I mean, I know it's very common for Victorians, and I'm not singling you out, but my mate Andrew Rule, who you'll discover through this book, keeps saying that Sydney is the most corrupt city outside of Prohibition-era Chicago. I think that might be just a Victorian view of New South Wales. If you look at Victoria in the last 20 years, I have to say that I think they're doing a fair deal to catch up. But look, there's no question. I think anyone who suggests that, in fact, the New South Wales police force in the era before, say, about 1979, was a model of propriety, just didn't understand how the world works. We had a police force which was riddled with corruption. We had a succession of police commissioners whose job it is surely to ensure that, in fact, the police force is clean, who were themselves, I think, now credibly alleged to have been corrupt. But by the way, from 1979 onwards, with the appointment firstly of Jim Lees, New South Wales basically has had a succession of honest police commissioners. And some of them, not so much Lee's, because I don't think he had sufficient standing in the higher levels of the force, but Cess Abbott, John Avery. These are people, and Peter Anderson, people forget that Peter Anderson introduced probably one of the most significant discipline packages that any police minister has ever introduced. But it wasn't, of course, until the Royal Commission that the full extent of the corruption in the New South Wales Police Force became known to the public. So I think a lot of the issues that you raise, I think most of them go back to the fact that we had a police force. And by the way, a lot of the reasons for the corruption in the police force is that we had laws prohibiting behaviour that Australians of all form of walk refused to accept as criminal. We had laws prohibiting illegal casinos, but everyone of my age in this room probably went to an illegal casino. My mother-in-law, when my parents moved from Gundagai, Rosemary's parents moved from Gundagai to Sydney, her mother asked her father if he could arrange an SP bookie for her. He, of course, went off to the Farmers and Graziers Association, who supplied him with a list. And the one she ended up with was a retired magistrate. And after her death, Rosemary had the job of settling her outstanding bills. Not that there were many, and not that they were substantial, but one of them was to the SP bookie. So Rosemary sent off a note explaining that her mother was dead, and enclosing the cheque, I think it was for $30, something like that. The cheque came back torn up with a note on butcher's paper, torn butcher's paper, saying how sorry he was, knew that something was wrong. He hadn't heard from Alice for a long time. And I remember saying to Rosemary at the time, I don't think the TAB would have torn up the cheque. But this is basically, as Wran constantly said, when he was being urged to close down SP bookies, as Wran would say, Australians of all forms, New South Wales people of all forms, whether from ministers down, refuse to accept that form of gambling. So when you have those sorts of laws that people are ignoring, then it is tailor-made for police corruption.
I wanted to ask if you think that it is useful to have a lawyer as the head of government, as opposed to people who have been, say, in the police corps, or even leader of the opposition. I find myself, I come from Victoria too, but I find myself constantly thinking, oh, no, don't put it that way. No, and it's not just about public relations, it's about an understanding of how things work.
I have no objection to lawyers leading a government of the state that I live in. I think lawyers, they have an understanding of the law, and they have an understanding of the rule of law that a lot of other people don't have. And I would always like to be led by a head of government who is fully committed to the rule of law, who is fully committed to the principle of the presumption of innocence. And I think it's more likely that that such a person will be someone who's legally trained. Wran, incidentally, you might remember there's quite a famous incident that Tom Kelly was involved in after the publication of the Age tapes. Wran was invited to address a dinner of the Council for Civil Liberties, and the Council for Civil Liberties had passed a motion condemning the police tapes, but calling for an inquiry into their content. Now, Wran regarded that resolution as insipid, and at the dinner rather ripped into the Council for Civil Liberties. It was widely leaked and described as a tirade, but Brian Dale and others will agree with me here. Those of us who copped tirades from Wran would know that was not that was not a tirade. But Wran's commitment to civil liberties was extraordinarily strong, and and he said after, Rodney Cavalier has written that in his final cabinet meeting, the one that farewelled him, that he thought his greatest failure was to resist the reversal of the presumption of innocence. And about a year later he gave a speech in which he bemoaned that as well. But I think if you look at what's happened over the last 40 years, that reversal of the presumption of innocence is just receded at an extraordinary rate. What we have now is really a presumption of guilt, not a presumption of innocence.
Before we go there, just come back, Milton. Just fill us in on you talk about the age tapes. Now, some people may not know what the age tapes were.
In about 1970, in about late 1960s, for over a decade, the New South Wales Police Force engaged in illegal tapping of the phones of suspected criminals. Many people believe that this was a rogue New South Wales police exercise. It wasn't a rogue exercise. It was done with the knowledge and the blessing of every police commissioner all the way through to John Avery, who was commissioner when it was all came undone. It only stopped because a telecom technician discovered a transmitter on a line one day and took it back to his bosses and said, what the hell is this? Now, shortly after that was discovered, the Age, I'll skip over the National Times, who had a slap at it first, but the Age in Melbourne published a selection of these transcripts, 526 pages of transcripts of this illegal taping. And I've got a chapter in the book on an allegation against Wran, which comes out of this so-called Age tapes. I make the point that the word Age tapes is a misnomer. They were the Age transcripts, because the Age didn't have any tapes. They had 3 cassettes. So they were never able to verify the transcripts against the actual tapes. And Justice Stewart, who subsequently had a Royal Commission to investigate this, was very scathing about the transcripts and about the objectivity of the police who were doing it. And I'm very, in the book, I'm very critical of the Age tapes, but of the fact that this illegal act was done. And by the way, many of the people who were critical of Wran for failing to clean up the cops were quite happy about this example of mass illegality by the New South Wales Police. But the point about this is that the only one allegation against Wran arose out of that Age tapes, and that allegation was actually investigated because it was one of the allegations that was made against Justice Lionel Murphy when, after his acquittal, you might remember the other members of the High Court bench were reluctant to allow him to come back and to sit on the bench, and the Hawke government was eventually forced to establish a parliamentary inquiry at which basically, scandalously, anyone who had any allegation was allowed to make an allegation against Lionel Murphy. There was something like about 30, I think, allegations. One of them was to do with Wran, and that was one of the ones that was actually investigated before the inquiry was shut down. Now, when it was announced that Murphy was dying, there was obviously, and he died about 3 months later, there was obviously no point in continuing this parliamentary inquiry, and it was shut down. But most of the documents before that inquiry were released in 2017, and the document I quote in here, in a chapter called "The Russian Tank and the Network of Influence," it actually had completed its work by the time it was shut down, and it proved, in fact, that the allegation against Wran was wrong. Now, you've got to ask yourself, well, if this allegation was wrong, allegedly out of the Age tapes, why should we believe any of the other allegations that were made? So.
Thank you, Milton, and thank you for standing up for good journalism and soldiering on. I also think it's admirable that as a staffer you're continuing your loyalty to Neville Wran. I think what you would say though is that you're more concerned with journalists acting honourably and never forgetting the rules of their craft. Can you give us some insights then, as a good old journo, what it was actually like working with Neville Wran?
Yes, well, I should say, and I say in the preface to the book, after I left Wran staff and went into journalism, our relationship became somewhat rocky. So it was you know, my job at the Sydney Morning Herald, I was an editorial writer and columnist. My job was to comment objectively on the Wran government, and occasionally it would get me into some trouble. So as I said, it was, and then of course the book was published, the biography was published in '86, and even though that biography, I don't think anyone's ever suggested the biography was hagiography, and even though there was no suggestion in that book that Wran was corrupt or that Wran ran a corrupt administration, it is true that we were critical in that book of Wran's handling of some of the corruption incidents. Criticisms which, by the way, I have tempered in this new book because of new evidence that I've come across. So it was rather amusing when the controversy was on over the Ghost Train fire to be described, I think, as a Wran apologist and a member of the St Neville Brigade, I think it was how it was put. So it wasn't as if you know, this book has been written by an acolyte of Wran. I want to make that very clear. What it was like to work with Wran. He was incredibly intelligent, witty, amusing, and he had an almighty temper. And I was reminding Brian Dale the other day of one occasion when Brian, Cherry Gleeson, his permanent head, and I were lined up in front of Wran's desk. I had discovered an error and had brought it to Jerry's attention. I won't go into the long details. Anyway, the three of us were lined up, and Wran was giving us the benefit of his opinion of the quality of his permanent head and the quality of his staff. And this went on for, I swear it went on for a good 5 minutes. Every second word was F. And I couldn't understand why I was copying most of the abuse. And I looked across, and Dale was staring at his feet and Jerry was staring out the window, and I realised that I was copying the abuse because I was the only one who was staring him in the eyes. So I suddenly found something to look at as well, and it went off from there. Terry Sheehan also tells a story. I can't remember who the minister was late for cabinet one day, and said to you, he said to another cabinet minister, "What have I missed?" And the cabinet minister said, only about 1,000 f***s and 100 cunts. That's right. So that was the side around. But by the way, they went. Those sort of things disappeared almost immediately. They were over as quickly as they came. But one of the amusing things for me, I worked in the Ministerial Advisory Unit under David Hill. David Hill and Wran used to have these monumental blues. And David, who's currently writing something of a memoir, said to me, he said, "I never ever copped any abuse from Wran." And I said, "David, you've got to be kidding. you and Wran put on some of the most spectacular performances any of us ever seen." And at the time, David was only 20, I think he was 29 or 30. And at the end of all of these, I used to think, this guy's only 30 and he's taking on the Premier of the state. But anyway, look, it was. I think every one of the Wran staffers would agree. And the ministers would agree. It was a fun time. It was a fun time.
There's a question here, but I've got a Zoom question first. This is one of our people in Nara. He says you've spoken about Ghost Train. You've spoken about the Four Corners. He thinks you may have been a bit soft on the Sydney Morning Herald.
No,
Because you're a former editor is the question. Not very polite now, by the way.
I'm afraid there's a whole chapter of the book devoted to Kate McClymont. But I hasten to add, it's not. I've never been critical of Kate's newspaper journalism. You'll see when you read the chapter, it's about allegations she's made in two of her books about people, and I think it's fair to say that I've torn the allegations to shreds. So I haven't been all that soft on the Sydney Morning Herald. But the Sydney Morning Herald, by the way, was very reluctant to follow up the Ghost Train fire. I don't know if you remember at the time. In fact, most of the mainstream media stayed away from the Ghost Train fire, and I think it was largely that a lot of the journalists had a look at the evidence that was put forward and decided that this really wasn't something that stood up a great deal. It was the Australian, Troy Bramston, the Australian, who wrote the first very critical article about it, quite a long article. But most of the mainstream media stayed away from it. Yeah.
Thank you. Two quick questions. One, the nickname Nifty, was that a term of endearment or something else? And secondly, what do you think are the main things that have contributed to the slide in journalism, which we're all aware of, but young people don't appear to be?
Look, the term Nifty was actually given to him by Morgan Ryan, the rather infamous solicitor, who was involved very much in the Lionel Murphy affair and the age tapes. It was actually, funnily enough, borrowed from a jockey. You will remember Neville Selwood, whose nickname was Nifty Neville Selwood. So it was borrowed from him. Andrew Rule in the book tries to make a great deal about the fact that that Nifty is well, as I say, it was a rather peculiar form of nominative determinism as far as Andrew Rule was concerned, but realistically it was borrowed from Nifty Neville Selwood, and many other Nevilles have since attracted the same nickname in the cause of alliteration. But yes, it was a term of, I think, a term of affection in those days. Most people saw it as a badge of honour. The slide of journalism. Look, I'm not particularly critical of journalism in general. I think it's a much tougher job now than when I was in it 20 odd years ago. The cutbacks that have occurred, the financial strife, the disappearance of the rivers of gold, all of which make life in journalism very, very difficult now. A succession of things. I mean, just before I started on the Sydney Morning Herald, we used to have a thing called the reader's room. So there were a whole collection of people who literally read every page, every proof page of the Herald before it was published, picking up mistakes and sending them back to be corrected. Now, that was one of the first economy measures to go, of course, when cutbacks started to occur. When Paul Bailey and I started in journalism on the Sydney Morning Herald, the sub-editor's bench, was an extraordinarily powerful bench. You could be summoned around by the chief sub in the way that we used to get summoned by the headmaster at school. Now, over the years, that authority fell away. The numbers of subs were cut, again as an economy measure. At some stage, sub-editing was even delegated outside the organisation. And I think I'm right to say, Paul, at one stage the subs were actually in New Zealand, weren't they? So it's pretty hard to expect a sub in New Zealand to be on top of, for example, New South Wales politics and be aware when mistakes occurred. So a lot of these structural changes in journalism, I think, have contributed, obviously, to difficulties we now see in journalism. But that's not the whole explanation. If I'd been Kim Williams and had miraculously been appointed as chairman of the ABC, I think one of the first things I would have done by Kim, I would have ordered an internal inquiry by the new ABC Ombudsman into the Ghost Train fire documentary and to have the board know just how that documentary was put together, who was in charge of it, who saw the full tapes, who saw the edited tapes, because I think it would be very instructive for the management, the senior management and the board of the ABC to see the way in which that documentary was put together, and to ask themselves, is this really the sort of journalism that we're pouring out now? So I've got no explanation as to how that documentary ever went to air. None at all.
So a final question. A few of us criticised the first round. It just seemed extraordinary that it went to air. But then you took it up with the ABC chair, and there was some kind of resolution, but we never sort of found out what actually happened.
Yeah. Well, two things happened. I lodged an objection under the then objection provisions of the ABC. My objection was rejected. I then took it up with Ita Buttrose directly, who was very responsive, I must say. She'd reply to emails at midnight and things like that. She then realised that particularly after I published something, that there were some serious flaws in the program, and she then commissioned Rod Tiffin and Chris Masters to do the review of the program. And they, of course, found that the allegations that it had made about Wran, they discredited those. At the same time, because my objection had been rejected, but the independent review said, look, there were serious problems here, she realised that there was obviously a problem in terms of how they were dealing with complaints about programs. So she then set up an external review of their complaints handling process, which led to the appointment of the Ombudsman, an external Ombudsman who's now in charge of complaints. And most significantly, in my view, the Ombudsman now reports to the Chairman of the Board, or reports to the Board, does not report to the Managing Director. Even though the Managing Director is obviously on the Board, I think it's a very significant step for the fact that it now reports to the Board rather than the Managing Director.
Many thanks. So it's great that the assassination of Neville Wran's been well received, with excerpts in the Financial Review and the Australian, and maybe more to come. It's an important book. We're very glad you came here tonight to talk about it, and some fascinating stories. I mean, without question, Neville Wran was one of the most important figures in Australian politics in the last century, and you've written about him in the past, and now you've cleared up a lot of other issues as well. So good luck with the book, and congratulations tonight.
Thank you.